All right, so my name's Adam Hollenberg, and for my TED Talk, I'm going to talk about my perspective on perspective. Translation in and of itself is a very hard art to perfect. The lack of ideal expressions in other languages, unique punctuation, and cultural specific barriers stand in the way of being able to create a technically perfect translation of pretty much any piece of literature. When the human rights dimension is added in, it becomes even harder to see the exact truth that is being communicated in a piece of writing. Classifying literature as human rights literature is tough. There is no other word for it, but I feel that it must be discussed before I delve into the meat of my presentation. Human rights literature, in my mind, as observed through the context of our course, is literature that expresses a lack of freedom, opportunity, or security to any degree in any facet of a person's life. This precursor brings me to the main point of my talk, perspective. It is easy to talk about perspective on a superficial level. Basically, all you need to figure out is who wrote what, about what, and from what background. I'm coming to our class from a different perspective. My concentration is international studies, probably like many of you, and my focus is on international security, norms, and cooperation. Thus, most of my coursework is in social sciences and history. In these courses, my job is to create detailed answers to superficial questions. But one thing I've learned in this class is that literature is really different. It is important to discuss the questions that you're asking and to have discourse about them and to explore every aspect of them. The reason that I'm choosing to discuss and analyze the importance of perspective in my talk is because I think it's a tremendously interesting lens through which to view the sort of literature and sources that we have been consuming in this course. Right now, I'm going to analyze the different types of perspectives that have been a part of our course. The Emancipation Proclamation, shown on the screen up here, was a landmark document in the history of our country, and with its publication came much emotion. However, the government clearly regarded it as nothing more than another piece of legislation. As you can see on this piece of paper up on the screen, there is no special presentation of the document, even though this version was presented to foreign diplomats from the Secretary of State, as it is addressed on the top left of the page. One would think that the United States would try and highlight the moral stand they were taking on behalf of a disenfranchised population. It also presents slavery as a political tool, not as a humanitarian disaster. A few quotes that prove this from the Secretary of State's preamble to the proclamation. He starts by saying, "You will receive by the post, which conveys this dispatch, evidences that the aggressive movement of the insurgents against the loyal states is arrested." By starting with this, it shows that the President or the Secretary of State clearly prioritizes the strategic goals against the Confederate States of America as opposed to the freeing of a disenfranchised population. He goes on to say, "It is the Union, not slavery, that must be maintained." This shows that in politicians' eyes, slavery is not to the detriment of freedom, but it is to detriment of the political union that they wish to maintain. This representation of the Emancipation Proclamation was done by an illustrator in New York. It shows the humanitarian side of the proclamation. On the far side are scenes from slavery, including a slave auction, a whipping, and slave catchers chasing runaways. On the left are scenes of economic prosperity, including pay, education, and industrial progress. They show the actual improvement of people's lives on the ground, and not just a political move to uphold the Union. However, it was the bland version that got sent out to foreign diplomats who were helping form impressions of the U.S. abroad at a time when information was very limited. It shows a certain hierarchy, that someone in America can put this glorious piece of art depicting the ascension of our nation to a new stage of morality on their wall, like Clayton Lewis said was common. It shows a certain hierarchy of politics, and that the goals of a few white men over the pursuit of self-determination by a large disenfranchised population. This shows that the two sides had a different emotional perspective on the issue, which is clearly displayed in how they present the proclamation. Next, I'm going to talk about sensory perspective. For assignment 7, I read a piece called Pulse Beyond the Horizon. I chose this piece because one of my major academic focuses is foreign affairs. I consider myself very up-to-date and informed on most newsworthy diplomatic happenings around the world at any given time. One important thread that runs through any news item these days is oil. Thus, oil policy and the process and politics of oil extraction are very interesting to me. This is what led me to this piece. The October 2012 issue of Words Without Borders, as it happens, was entitled Oil. This piece is about a man who works on oil rigs around the world in exchange for economic opportunity. He does not know the language of the locals in every place he goes, nor particularly enjoy the job, which he characterizes as exhausting, but he continues it, looking for economic opportunity and taking comfort in small things, such as familiarity with a city or looking forward to seeing friends or a woman in the city that he's working. It was initially written in German by Anya Kampmann and translated by Annie Janusz. This piece used many descriptive phrases that showed me what the narrator was feeling through his five senses. One quote that stood out to me was, "I've started speaking my language again. It doesn't make me any more certain. It's much less easy than the 12 hours of work on the rig, that heavy exhaustion that comes with the ocean air." Here, he's using his senses to depict the toll that his job as an oil rig worker takes on him. He says that the way that he feels is associated with what he smells and experiences while working on a rig. He also characterizes his work as a language, which shows that familiarity breeds comfort in some cases, but also not in others. Nature's input to his senses triggers feelings that seep into the narrative of the story, thus altering the perspective that the piece comes from. He says this specific quote while on land pursuing a woman around the familiar alleys of Cairo. This shows me that familiarity and the senses can have both positive and negative effects on a person's experience, and thus affect the outcome of the message that is being received from the text. Next, I will talk about how perspective can be manipulated. A quote from Thomas Keenan's piece, Mobilizing Shame, states, "The lawyer Irwin Coulter argued that exposing gaps between self-professed norms and behavior could actually change said behavior." This quote from this piece of reading distills the term mobilizing shame very well. Basically, if you show someone messing up or doing something wrong, they will want to correct this mistake for the sake of their image and the shame that comes with having that image sullied. This is a very useful tactic when it comes to reporting on or writing about human rights. For example, in Brose's piece, he uses multiple perspectives of multiple citizens of the former Yugoslavia to prove how there were some good people among all the evildoers that were so pervasive during that conflict, when primarily you would be seeing news reports and reading journal entries about dire circumstances throughout the territory. Sometimes it is very easy to detect this tactic. Keenan uses an example of CNN reporting from a beachhead in Mogadishu, Somalia during the American intervention there in the 1990s. As Keenan so aptly sums it up, the commando team that landed on the beachhead were surprised to meet members of the news media who made their job difficult. What these soldiers did not know, he claims, is that the goal of the mission was to produce images for the media to show that Americans are intervening with a huge amount of force in the name of humanitarianism. This shows that perspective can be manipulated to suit the goals of a certain party. This picture will kind of show, I have a few pictures that will show mobilizing shame in a pretty practical light. Here you see a young Palestinian kid, we can assume, who's unarmed, throwing a stone at a group of heavily armed and well-equipped Israeli troops. And while one piece of the media might say that the Israeli forces would be using disproportionate force, maybe you flip the camera and see this perspective of what's happening behind the Palestinian boy. A riot with automatic weapons with huge numbers. And while both of these are obviously terrible situations, it shows that perspective can be manipulated to suit the interests of the party reporting. Because both of these did happen, Israelis do respond in disproportionate force to Palestinians, and Palestinians do scare Israelis when they have automatic weapons and are rioting. Next, I'll revisit this image that was actually spoken about in class today. This shows an interesting perspective on the city of Jerusalem, which obviously holds a deep significance for multiple cultures. At the top, you can see the word Yerushalayim in Hebrew, which is the name just Jerusalem translated literally. In the second line, you will see Jerusalem spelled out in Arabic, and then in parentheses, I believe you will see Al-Quds, which is the religious Muslim name for the city. On the bottom, of course, is Jerusalem in English. While some people may choose to look at this image as coming from the perspective of Israelis, it would seem most convenient that since this sign is on Highway 1 from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in Israel, that Yerushalayim is on the top. If you were to see this sign in the Palestinian territories, it would probably be interesting to note that you would see this on the top. And this just shows the multiple perspectives that different people have on the same thing, and that they can, and how it can be manipulated to advance an agenda. When discussing the translation of human rights literature, it is extremely important to take perspective into account. What kinds of perspectives are being portrayed and by whom? Who is doing the translating? Where is the agenda trying to lead your thoughts and sympathies? It is important to ask which perspective someone is coming from when they write or translate something, especially on a topic as sensitive as human rights. However, it is even more important to investigate perspective itself. How is it observed? How can it be changed? How can it be used? Perspective is something that everyone should keep in mind while reading any work pertaining to human rights, especially one that has been translated. This perspective, the more perspective that can exert influence on a work, the more convoluted the message of the work can become.